Hi BookTube, it's Amy. So I'm back again with another reading from Orcutt's Kingdom of Books. And here in the third chapter, Orcutt talks about books al fresco and about the outdoor book stalls of Paris, which have always intrigued me greatly since I heard about them. And here he is telling some stories about them and lamenting how the really choice finds that people claim or tell tale of once having found there are no longer to be found there just because of changes in how books are sold. So he writes, "Years before my first visit to Paris, I knew that one of the points of interest that city held for me would be the old bookstalls on the left bank of the Seine. This conviction was perhaps first formed after reading Sterne's Sentimental Journey, in which the vivacious chronicle describes his experience on the Quai de Conti, where he endeavored to secure a copy of Hamlet to refresh his memory as to the advice Polonus gave his son upon the subject of travelling. The fact that the traveller was diverted from his purpose by the unexpected appearance of the begooling fille de chambre did not prevent the author from giving a charming picture of the contact between the would-be purchaser and the bookstall man. And it may have been just as well that Polonus was not put in the embarrassing position of having his counsels so rudely disregarded. When I first ventured forth upon my buconistic odysseys, I used to start at the Quai Montebello, across from Notre Dame, and end on the Quai d'Orsay, opposite the Museum of the Legion of Honor, a marvelous journey to complete within so brief a space of time, taking me from the Paris of the Middle Ages, through the Paris of the Bourbons and the Revolution, into the Paris of today. The contrast between the Students' Quarter and the Faubourg Saint-Germain is not so striking now as it used to be, but could a more fitting atmosphere be created in which to pore over ancient volumes and to ruminate upon the present and the past? In later years, I have covered less territory. The stalls containing school books, a godsend to the students of the neighboring Sorbonne and Collège de France, once largely confined to the Quai Saint-Michel, have gradually overflowed upon the Quai de Grande Augustins, and contain little of interest from a physical or historical standpoint, and the iterant stands hawking celluloid combs, collars, and fountain pens, which now dispute parking space with the boutiques on the Quai de Conti, suggest a fallen estate from the time when Papa Mallory boasted rarer volumes than the indoor bookshops could produce. So now I confine my book hunting almost wholly to the Quai Malaquais and to the Quai Voltaire, for the bookstalls of the Quai d'Orsay below the Point Royal are as uninteresting as those above the Point d'Art, and when I become foot-weary, I return to the Quai de Conti and take my favorite seat outside a restaurant located, as nearly as I can tell, upon the very spot where the Café Anglais once stood, that famous rendezvous of the elite in the 18th century. Most people, even Parisians, recall the Café Anglais only after it moved to the corner of the Boulevard des Italiens and the Rue Marvaux, but that is because of its later popularity under the Empire, when Alphonse Karr, Jules Janin, Théophile Gautier, Adolphe Goff, and the Duc de Gramont Cadrousse honored it with their patronage, or perhaps the extravagant dinners given there by the gay Prince Demidoff may have helped to keep its fame alive. Some evening, after you have ordered your numbered duck and your panquette soufflé at the Tout d'Argent, get mine host Terrail to tell you how the Café Anglais, with its marvelous cellar, became joined to his own ancient establishment through the bonds of matrimony, celebrated between the families of the proprietors. So while I sip my vermouth at the little table in front of the Café de Beaux Arts, and watch the bouquiniers as they search for what they probably will never find, I like to conjure up the scene I might have witnessed sitting in front of the Café Anglais a century and a half before. For this was the celebrated Faubourg Saint-Germain. All fashionable Paris promenaded there each afternoon, the smart women of fashion in company with exquisite escorts, their cheeks bright with rouge, the color heightened by patches of black court plaster, wearing petticoats of the latest mode with fascinating Chinese fans in their hands, and their trains held from the soiling ground by weirdly costumed lackeys. The bookstalls were a part of the grand ensemble. Thither the gallant blade would lead his fair companion to pick up, as if by chance, some choice example of the printer's or the binder's art, which he had previously located and concealed, and to discuss it with affected erudition. Then, disdaining to inquire the price, he would toss a golden louis to the bouquetnik as the volume was gracefully presented to its new owner. The French Revolution put an end to all this gaiety, and while the economic conditions which resulted flooded the bookstalls with rare and beautiful volumes from the libraries of impoverished noble families, priceless Eldines, rare Elzevers with wide margins, superb bindings by Nicolas Eve, de Soule, and Le Gascon, society never returned, thus proving that the literary adventures had been of secondary importance to the social pleasures. This was the period when the supply of rare books greatly exceeded the demand. Pujol records the fact that his grocer delivered his wares wrapped in full sheets of the Lettres de Voltaire, printed in fine type on handmade paper. I came to read this collection, Pujol remarks dryly, solely because I am fond of Gruyere cheese and cherries. By the time I began my browsing, many of the traditional customs had been abandoned. Occasionally the vendors would bark their wares, allons, vite, toutes sortes de livres curieux, bon manche, un franc, 50 la piece, but the loud calls had become modified by police insistence and later entirely disappeared. The unimportant volumes were still classified in trays marked at various prices, but the better ones were arranged in rows by size rather than by subject or value. In the old days, the basement bargain method obtained. If a book remained a week in one tray, it was automatically moved down into the group at the next lower price. Many an impecunious collector had patiently watched the downward march of a coveted volume, only to have it snatched from under his very nose because he waited a day too long. No longer do the bouquinistes laboriously trundle their stock back and forth each morning and evening in clumsy wheelbarrows. Since 1890, well-made wooden trays lined with zinc with lids that open into sloping roofs have contained the curious mixture of modern trash, old rubbish, and the occasional pearl. These trays are shut down and locked each night to iron bars firmly embedded in the granite parapet. The replenishing of the stock is not so simple now as formerly. In years gone by, the bulk of it came from the auction rooms, being made up of the discarded portions of private libraries of too little interest even to warrant the cost of cataloguing. The bouquinistes used to bid these in blindly, wrapping in packages of from 10 to 40 volumes. Later, they sorted them out and arranged them on their boutiques, pricing them in accord with a system each devised for himself. Whether his classification was right or wrong was decided by his customers. Some treasures undoubtedly came through theft on the part of servants or children, but the bookstall men as a class have always been honest tradesmen, and they have usually made sure that such sales were authorized. Now they depend almost wholly on the stock secured from private individuals, dispersing their libraries, and as the indoor bookshops get first choice, the remnants could scarcely be expected to make as attractive bargains as were earlier disclosed. 20 years ago, Leopold Delisle, then librarian of the Bibliothèque Nationale, made me realize the place the bookstall men hold in the life of Paris. Through him, I also learned of the long contest between three well-known characters of the last century for the proud title of Doyen de Bouquinistes. There was Pierre Maury, who had plied his trade at the same stall on the Quai de Conti for 62 years before he dried up like the parchment of some old book, and was wafted away to a permanent shelf in the library of Kingdom Come. He had a real knowledge of the books he handled, and when he made a price, that was what you paid, or you left the volume for some more appreciative purchaser. Customers came to buy, but remained to talk. Papa Mallory was a marvelous mimic, and enjoyed nothing better than to act out some amusing experience with an overconfident purchaser who had expected to beat him down in his price. Père Rosé, so Monsieur Delay's story went, embraced the responsibilities of bookselling, not from a love of literature, but because his wife, who was the proprietress of a flourishing stationery shop on the Rue de Saint-Père, refused to give him money for his tobacco. He made an average profit of 8 sous a day, but that covered his smoking expenses and was almost twice as much as a soldier of France earned, so why complain? And in both cases the cost of living was otherwise provided. His claim to seniority was based on his age rather than on his length of service. Papa de Boss, it seemed, boasted the friendship of Anatole France, who sketched him thus: "Every year his height grows less, and his stall grows smaller and lighter. If death leaves my old friend a little longer to live, a puff of wind will some day carry him off with the last pages of his books, and the few oats that the neighboring horses drop from their grey nose bags." Meanwhile he is almost happy. If he is poor, he does not think about it. He does not sell his books, but he reads them. He is an artist and a philosopher. He hails me and says, like a man who has read his morning paper, "You come from the Academy. Did the young people speak well of Monsieur Hugo?" Then with a wink he whispers in my ear, "A bit of a demagogue is Monsieur Hugo." Père de Bois began business on the quays a little earlier than Père Malloret, but was younger in years. Papa Mallory's own argument was with Père Rosé would have lost against Père de Bois, but he promptly altered his attitude. No one of the three ever yielded, and the crown was never officially awarded. My particular friend among the bouquinistes is Charles Daudman, who has presided over his stall on the Quai Voltaire with quiet dignity for 27 years. On the popular postcard of the Quai, Doberman is glorified as the poète bouquiniste and as the oldest bookseller. The first portion of the description says too little, for he is not only a poet but an author, being the biographer of the bookstalls, and a writer of romances as well. But he is by no means the present doyen. Dame Chevalier has been in business on the Quai d'Orsay for half a century, and Francisque on the Quai Malaquais for a period of 5 years. The publishers know better, Père Daudman explained simply, but they think it helps them to sell their cards. In experience and in my love of books, perhaps I am the oldest. He was a journalist once, but an accident to his leg forced him to change his life plan. He loved books. The profession of the bouquiniste offered him a living, and when not serving customers, his time is his own for reading and writing, and it gives him an opportunity to meet kindred spirits and other lovers of books who frequent the quays. "If I were on the editorial staff of some great journal, as I once hoped to be," he confided, "we would not be talking about books as we are now, should we? Life has its compensations." Père Daudman speaks a little English, a remnant from his childhood, for his mother was the daughter of an English vicar of Brighton. His father was a French cavalry officer, decorated by the Legion of Honor. "My grandfather was a great friend of Lord Byron. It is natural that I should love books, but I do not like the commerce," he adds with a grimace as a customer beats him down from 5 francs to 4 on a selected bouquin. "I would rather read a book or write a book than sell a book, but one must live." The average bookstall man is more susceptible to bargaining than were his predecessors, due to the fact that he possesses less knowledge as to real values. He bases his trade largely on his cleverness in psychology and regulates the price in accord with the eagerness or stupidity of the customer. And here we have a photograph of Daudman selling his books. Was it Emerson who said that a man's greatest asset is the imbecility of those about him? Still, in a lesser way, he is the same eccentric, good-natured philosopher, combining ignorance and knowledge, naivety and craft to a surprising degree. They are characters, every one of them, and to win their confidence is a real achievement. It would be a pity to have the profession decline or disappear, for these open-air vendors are a national institution, and from the very beginning have earned their right to live by their successful struggle against governmental interference. In 1649, those Paris bookstores which boasted the dignity of indoor quarters succeeded in having an edict issued against the stall-keepers, which made the offering of any book, particularly on the Pont Neuf or thereabouts, punishable by confiscation, the property thus seized being turned over to him who made complaint. Again, in 1721, after the bouquinists had succeeded in re-establishing themselves, a royal edict accused them of offering for sale volumes which were detrimental to the government of the state and to the purity of morals. And again, the outdoor vendors were obliged to seek other methods of plying their trade. They were attacked once more in 1822, but this time the only result was the establishment of rigid regulations, which in the long run undoubtedly improved their status. Baron Haussmann, Napoleon III's prefect, was responsible for the last attempt to dislodge them from their picturesque environment. The Baron's aesthetic sense was offended by having the quays of Paris littered up with the wooden trays containing moth-eaten volumes, which became more and more offensive to the sight after long exposure to the elements. His great idea was to offer the bookstallmen quarters at La Vallée, the old poultry market, which had been left vacant on the Quai de Grand Augustins by the opening of the Halles Centrales. Baron Haussmann undoubtedly was influenced in this idea of establishing a central book market in Paris by the custom which obtained at that time in certain German towns. But the bouquinists had no notion of exercising their function within doors. For over 100 years they had carried on their trade in the open, and the Latin temperament holds to tradition with stubborn tenacity. In their time of tribulation, a champion appeared in Paul Lacroix, a faithful friend and patron. If I were asked who is the happiest man, Lacroix once said, I would reply a book lover. Whence it results that happiness is an old book. He was known to the bouquinists by the affectionate nickname of Bibliophile Jacob, and his interest in their welfare was as sincere as that he manifested in their volumes. He took the matter personally to the emperor and succeeded in arousing Napoleon's sympathy for the downtrodden stall-keepers. The emperor even made a round of the stalls with Bibliophile Jacob as his guide, and as a result took the bouquinists under his protection. A story still holds its legacy position, which may have had bearing upon the emperor's decision. It is said that while making this memorable excursion with Bibliophile Jacob, he passed along the Quai Mauquet, where he saw one of the venerable bookstallmen seated before a portable stove, in which was burning a fire kept alive by leaves of books, which he tore out a handful at a time from a pile of volumes beside him. This was old Père Fouille. The emperor approached him, curious to know what volumes were considered of such little value as to be used for this purpose. At his request, Père Fouille gave him the book from which he had just torn a fresh supply of fuel. The title page still remained Conquêtes et Victoires des Français. The emperor, holding the mutilated volume in his hand, turned to his guide. This volume, he said, was written to feed the flame of patriotism in the hearts of my people, and not to supply heat for the worn-out body of a bookstall man. Far better to make it possible for him to sell it than that he should be obliged to burn it. The collection of book trays and stalls along the different quays may look alike to the casual observer, but each has an individuality, less marked now than formerly, that is as distinct as the personalities of the bookstall men themselves. The Quai Voltaire used to be the aristocratic zone, but only the oldest of the bouquinists would claim this distinction now. I always fancy that Quai Voltaire, for it was here that I had my earliest adventure. After an hour's search through trays which were overloaded with junk, I came upon a large quarto volume of Don Quixote in French, containing Poussin's engravings of Gustave Doré's wonderful illustrations. It was printed in Paris in 1863 on superb French rag paper, the typography showing great care and skill, and the presswork is a fine, even color. The 1860s were not years famous for bookmaking excellence in other parts of the world, but in France the standard established by the Didots still obtained. Then the joy of my discovery was diminished. The volume I had found proved to be the second of a 2-volume edition, and the first volume was conspicuous by its absence. The bookstall man was as surprised as I, and he overturned his entire stock in his search. At last an idea came to him. I may have it in my storeroom, he announced. There is another volume there exactly like this, but I left it behind because I thought it was a duplicate. But if I show 2 books of the same title, I have to make a lower price. Will monsieur come again in the morning, and we shall see what we shall see. On the following day, I was at the quay before the stalls opened for business. After half an hour's wait, my man appeared carrying a large bundle wrapped in newspapers, with a smile on his face which denounced success. I have it here, he declared happily. I have the first volume here. He laboriously untied the string, carefully folded up the newspapers for future use, and placed the book triumphantly before me. "It was a natural mistake, was it not?" he asked. "Who could know that one great volume the size of this should not contain all a writer had to say on any subject? But here it is, and you shall have both." I was too pleased to think of haggling over the price he asked, but no doubt I might have made the purchase for half the sum. He confided to me, as he wrapped the 2 volumes in the newspapers he had so carefully preserved, that in a way he was glad to be rid of the books, for they took up too much room in his stall. There was once a time when one might count on seeing the same faces peering day by day into the wooden trays, lifting one by one the various volumes, each eagerly searching for rarities in his own special subject. Some of these faithful ones are even now remembered by name. One of these, already mentioned, was Paul Lacroix, bibliophile Jacob. His specialty was romances of the 18th century and of the imperial period, but while he sought books, he absorbed the physiology and psychology of the bookstall men, embodying his reflections in a small volume entitled Ma Republique. "In personal appearance," writes bibliophile Jacob, "the bookstall man partakes of the condition of his books, exposed to all the vicissitudes of weather, sprouted and shriveled in the sun, beaten and dried by the wind, spotted and discolored by the rain. The only manual de libraire studied is the physiognomy of the purchaser. One smiles, another sighs, another knits his brow, another bites his lips. A fifth, more troubled, will finger 22 volumes before he sets his hand on the book he desires, and all betray themselves in some way which does not escape the bookstall man, who is as acute and astute as an English ambassador. I have never found a real Eldine on the quays. By this I mean one printed by Aldus Manutius. But I have secured several excellent examples of later issues from the Eldine press. After the death of Aldus in 1515, the press, to which had already been added the plant of Nicholas Jensen, was continued by Aldus's father-in-law, Andrea de Torresani, Andrea's 2 sons, Francesco and Federico, and later Pallas, Aldus's son. None of Aldus's successors was his equal, but the encouragement and assistance that came to the press through the patronage of Jean Grolier, treasurer of the Duchy of Milan under Louis VIII, resulted in volumes which compare well with the typographical product of the period. The Quai de Grand Augustins is supposed to be the most democratic, where highbrows and lowbrows rub shoulders without disdain, each confidently deceiving himself into believing that he will find that for which he seeks. It was here that I found one of these Eldine volumes, which is of much interest aside from its physical appearance. It was printed in 1564, all in that same metallic type in which the epoch-making Virgil was set, with folios only on the odd pages. At the end is an early index, set up much as a modern printer would arrange it, but with the entries, of course, indexed under their given names rather than under the family cognomen. It contains intimate letters exchanged between famous men of the period, such as Marco Antonio Colonna, Pope Clement, the Duke of Urbino, various Doges of Venice, and Michelangelo. Throughout the volume, the signatures of 2 writers were laboriously erased, first by scratching with a knife, and then obliterated by ink, showing that some early censor had carefully stricken out offending names. The book seemed to be in its original vellum binding, but the leaves were trimmed down, sometimes almost bleeding into the folios. Many of the issues of the Eldine press were sold in sheets, each purchaser binding to suit his own taste. So in this case, perhaps the responsibility rests upon some careless original binder. When the bouquinist becomes friendly, he becomes talkative. He grumbles over the decline in customers and loves to remind you of the good old days, and to recall traditional book hunters who have enriched the bookstall men. Boulard was one of these in the early 19th century. Boulard, the old notary, whose face and memory are unforgettable, writes Usain. He bought books by the meter, by the toise, by the acre. He bought in detail, en bloc, by the basket, by the heap, his drawing rooms, his vestibules, his lumber rooms, his stairs, his bedrooms, his cupboards bent under the weight of his volumes. And there was Chantelay's, who sought copies of Dada's classics, and Champfleury, who specialized in engravings, and Fillette de Conche, whose passion was for autographs, fine figures all, and most popular with the bouquinists. The stalls of the Quai de Conte used to claim to be of higher rank than the others because of the literary quality of the bouquins exposed for sale. I have discovered as much rubbish here as elsewhere, but one book I found was of particular interest to me. This was a copy of Seneca's Morals, printed in London in 1711 for Jacob Tonson. There were 3 Tonsons who were publishers, but this is the one with whom Dryden had a private feud, characterizing him with these indignant and irritating words. With leering look, bull-faced and freckled-faced, with 2 left legs with Judas-colored hair and frowsy pores that taint the ambient air. It so happened that this was the first book published by Harper and Brothers in New York, when they began business in 1817. When the Harpers celebrated their 100th anniversary in 1917, they asked me to reprint this volume in a centennial edition, inserting facsimiles of the original title and text pages as illustrations, but making the format conform to the best typographical standards of the 20th century. A comparison of the title pages of the 3 editions, each one separated by 100 years, is interesting as illustrative of the taste of the 3 periods. Frankly, I like the 1711 title page better than the 1817 or the one I designed for the Harpers in 1917. And here we have title page example. So that would be the facsimile. And then we have, or perhaps that, I think this is the facsimile, that's the 1817. This is the 1917. And I think that's just another facsimile of a different edition. Let's see. Another name that will ever be held in grateful memory by the bouquinistes is that of Xavier Marmier. He was perhaps the most famous character who frequented the quays during the latter part of the last century. He specialized in volumes in foreign languages, particularly folklore, and his passion for book hunting was such that he designed a special costume to wear during the chase. In this, the pockets were large and deep, so that he could stow away his purchases with the greatest ease. So completely did he clear the stalls of the books in which he was interested, that such volumes came to be called Marmiers among the bookstall men. They had him to thank for many thoughtful acts and benevolences, the crowning tribute of his friendship being a clause in his will which read as follows: In remembrance of the happy moments I have passed among the bookstall keepers on the quays of the left bank, moments which I reckon among the pleasantest in my life, I leave to these worthy stall-keepers a sum of 1,000 francs. I desire that this amount shall be expended in paying for a jolly dinner, and in spending an hour in convivially, in the thinking of me. This will be acknowledged for the many hours I have lived intellectually in my almost daily walks on the quays between the Point Royal and the Point Saint-Michel. I have been particularly fortunate in stumbling upon Elzevers at the stalls on the various quays. I have no illusions regarding them. I learned years ago that from bibliographical standpoint, an Elzever was almost valueless unless the title and the date were right. But I love a book for its significance rather than for its sales price. 2 are of particular typographic interest. Aside from their imprint, the works of Emperor Constantine, edited by Mercisius, was printed by Isaac Elzever in 1617 and is set in double column in Greek and Latin text. The Greek type is based on that design by Grandjoin for Christophe Plantin about 1550, which in turn was based upon the beautiful royal Greeks of Robert Etienne. The handling of these 2 texts side by side, overrunning and adapting as required when the Greek occupies more space than the Latin, is most skillful and shows a consummate knowledge of typographic precedent. No printer today, with the added experience of 300 years, could surpass it. I was pleased to find this volume regardless of its bibliographical value, because I was eager to own an example of Isaac Elzever's work. It was he who introduced the diminutive format, later carried to its best by Bonaventura and Abraham Elzever, which first attracted the attention of book lovers to this famous family of book builders. A most charming edition of La Metamorphose d'Ovid fell into my hands on the Quai de Conti. It was printed by Jan de Torrens at Lyons in 1564. This was the period when supremacy in printing rested in Antwerp, and the Christophe Plantin was the master printer of the world. Yet this less-known Lyonnese printer produced a volume which might well challenge comparison. The typography is delicate, as is appropriate to the subject, and each verse is illustrated by a copper plate etching, all enclosed in a series of delightful borders, varying in design yet harmonious in their entirety. The printing is on thin French laid rag paper. My copy has a full red morocco binding, elaborately hand-tooled, and the little volume is held together by 2 leather clasps, tipped with designed bosses. I bless the binder for his restraint in trimming the leaves so little in the rebinding. And there is an illustration here of this charming edition he is describing. My most recent buconistic acquisition also came from the Quai Voltaire in 1924. I had just made a pilgrimage to the Plantin Shrine at Antwerp and reached Paris with the various exhibits freshly in mind. In the second drawing room of the museum, I had been attracted by a deed dated November 27, 1630, by which Rubens conveyed to Balthasar Morotus, the first Christophe Plantin's son-in-law and successor, for the sum of 4,920 florins, 328 copies of the works of Herbertus Goltzius, printed in 4 volumes by Jacobus Bizes at Antwerp in 1617. It seemed that Balthasar bought these sheets with the idea of making a 5th volume to include Goltzius' history of the Roman emperors, enriching the text with medallions cut on wood by Christoph Jaeger. The original blocks, 160 in number, for which the printer paid 6 florins each, I had examined in the room of wood engravings. The first 4 volumes were brought up to date by printing new titles and prefaces, using the sheets already printed by Bizes for the text. Beautiful copperplate titles were designed, too, by Rubens himself, and the 5 volumes were issued as a complete set in 1644 to 1645, 4 old volumes with new font matter, and 1 new volume with medallions printed in black on a brown background. And at the end, the famous Plantin mark. Once in Paris, I found myself again browsing among the bouquins on the second-hand bookstalls on the Quai Voltaire. It seemed as if the percentage of rubbish had increased more than ever since my previous visit, when suddenly I discovered 5 quarto volumes bound in the original vellum, almost hidden among the worthless clutter. Opening the top volume, I was amazed to find myself looking at the black and brown medallion of the Emperor Frederikus of the series I had so recently seen at the Plantin Mortis Museum. A further examination disclosed the complete set in perfect condition, one of the 328 copies in the manufacture of which Peter Paul Rubens, famous artist, and Balthasar Morotus, famous printer, had collaborated. These are a few of the interesting items for which I hold the bouquinists in grateful memory. They are not of extraordinary value when compared with Eldis's Hypertomaca Polyphy, which Nordier boasted of picking up for 6 sous. But such bargains will never again be found on the quays. The booksellers of Paris have long since learned how to cull the stock of the bookstall man in advance of his appearance in the trays, and their superior knowledge of real value stands them in good stead. Still, even though what I call my treasures from the quays are not necessarily those which would fetch the highest prices in the auction room, they have served their full purpose in that they give me continuing pleasure. In these days of limited housing space, I feel that one should ask himself why a new book or an old one should be added to his library rather than why it should not. A beautiful piece of furniture, a fine painting, a book, each expresses its own message in its own way, but that message cannot be intelligible to the receiver if coveted and secured simply for the love of acquisition. As a matter of fact, there is a good deal of sentimentality about books that border on the maudlin. I agree with Augustine Birrell when he says, "Book hunting is a respectable pursuit, an agreeable pastime, and aid to study, but so are many other pastimes and pursuits." Well, it would be historians of book hunting caught but a little Well, it would be if historians of book hunting caught but a little of the grateful simplicity and sincerity of an Isaac Walton or a Gilbert White. But no, for the most part these historians are masses of affectation, boasters of bargains, retailers of prices, never touching the heart or refining the fancy. Sham raptures over rare volumes and bombastic accounts of bygone auctions have never helped to swell the ranks of the noble army of book hunters. Except for Père Dodman, no modern vendor has appeared to take the place of Père Rosé or Père Mallory or Père de Boss. No more may one pick up the first letter from Emergio Vespucci or Lorenzo de Medici or an Elzevir Molière for a few sous, or discover choice Eldines or Caxtons or Etiennes or Baskervilles for the price of a magazine. Yet the remote chance of an occasional treasure amidst the rubbish keeps alive the vigor of the chase. It was not so long ago that Gabriel Hancock might have been seen frequenting the quays in his search for material bearing upon the great Richelieu, whose life he was engaged in writing, or Francois Coppée searching for a human note to catch and fix for all eternity. Chance passers-by are attracted to the stalls by curiosity, and may find some volume that happens to appeal. A few real book lovers, and a few only, still remain obsessed by their bibliomania, and continue to haunt the boutiques, stimulated by the atmosphere of the quays, pretending to themselves that they still expect to find the unexpected. Of such is the soul of the slave of the book. And we have here a reproduction of a Rubens title page. Quite a beautiful and intricate title page there. So that brings us to the end of chapter 3. I hope you enjoyed this reading. I will be back tomorrow with the next chapter here titled Books in the Cradle.